A one, a two, a one, two, three. Good evening, users.
Hello. So what follows is blah 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 a collection of videos, or as I've called it, a puzzle opinion or onion opinion, because it's composed of different references or quotations, citations taken from documentaries, interviews. Here's a sort of extract of what is being discussed and why the material that is being shown is organized in the way it is. Cannibalism is at the very beginning of the duality between Satan and God, from in Judaic culture, from Zoroastrian elements, so this notion of a good and a bad God, but then some elements of the Canaanite divinities are absorbed by God and others are absorbed by Satan. So the whole notion of cannibalism as an anthropological way of distinguishing you from other people is just a further element of this urbanization of human culture, where even in Babylonian society, human sacrifice and in extremes cannibalism was distanced further apart from the city and something of nature. The very distinction between man and animal, which can be seen in hunger, as in animals are usually enslaved to hunger, they don't have anything else to do but to look for the next meal. Man has, with technology and other things, managed to find surplus time. In the moment in which we stop being slaves to hunger in a very, very ancient past, and we start maybe just even only bringing our ancestors with us in our tummies, but not eating other people, then we have an evolution in human society, an improvement of the condition of the collectiveness. Before that, cannibalism must have been reserved only to animals. That is already a distinction. And if that is included in religion and spirituality, it is the only way to propagate these notions within your people, or your children, or your tribe. And this, in time, brings an advantage. Religions have a social function, and that these legends, these myths, rather than being real stories, are more functional to the utility they have. And if you go and look at this utility, you will understand better of the whole function. They represent the history of religion and of God as it has been useful to humans in the formation of society and in the various steps required for the progression of society. You can see these elements in how Christianity defines what is human and what is not human. It's one of those things that would always distinguish us from not having to be under the law of nature, like an animal. So religion has always tried to teach you that, because that is the basic step of collectiveness, of society. And that is in effect the first step towards civilization. And as oral history and religion and mythology are all closely connected and interrelated, the very notion of cannibalism being a bad thing is something that could have been there since we have been able to talk. If you want to play this game of wanting to see who God really is, thinking that the further back you will go, the more truth you will find, well, the last real truth is that the real distinction between man and animal is the will not to eat your kin starving of hunger.
So if you want to watch this collection of documentaries, and I'm not claiming ownership of any of these things, so basically welcome to Puzzle Opinion or Onion Opinion, and give it a try maybe.
What are the forces that bring out this primordial, unexplained element in our nature? Why does cannibalism continue to fascinate and appall? Each generation repackages and updates the ancient legends and unexplained urges of cannibalism. In a 1930s cartoon, cannibalism was laughingly portrayed as the preoccupation of savages. After Geen, the pop culture image of cannibalism took a much darker turn. His story influenced such horror classics as Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, released in 1960, the cult classic The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in 1990, Buffalo Bill's character in The Silence of the Lambs.
That's one of their ways to Practice or yeah.
I came here to ask you some questions. Maybe later.
He says the god from cremation, Lord Shiva, he gives them something to eat in the form of rotten bones or some kind of human flesh.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Alright. Okay. Maybe I'll take this off right now and then. Good. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Why are people on that side of the river so afraid of the Agori? I see. Why do you just make them a mistake? Maybe just like somebody distracts them and might just leave. Just be polite. Be very polite.
What did you say? Now he says, that skull, that's empty, that's hungry, he wants you to feed that, he wants you to make some donation to that.
What would you like me to do?
He says, he wants that skull to be filled with alcohol.
Okay, actually, it's in the boat. So,
Lucky. Narmada Giri Nagababa has lived life as a nomadic Agori since he was 11 years old. He's now 85 and absolutely radiant. The secret? Renouncing all of life's comforts, rubbing the bodies in the ashes of the dead, and being naked all contribute. I'm on board. As far as marijuana goes,
what our lovely friend Namada Giri Nagababa is saying is that there is no good or bad. The divine made everything, so everything's equal. Nagoris have simply figured out that if they immerse themselves in the pain, they'll eventually pass through it to find bliss and enlightenment. And I'm thinking that weed probably helps a little bit as well.
Cannibalism is most often associated with the twisted minds of serial killers, but they are just a small fraction of those who practice it. Some resort to it by necessity to fend off death by starvation. And entire societies use cannibalism as a ritual to signify ultimate respect or ultimate disrespect. Ritual cannibalism, seemingly unexplained, is not only to express power and disgust. Its symbolism is equally prominent as a rite of honor and commemoration. Here, on the western edge of Papua New Guinea, cannibalism lives on, not as a heinous act reserved for enemies, but as a sacred ritual that signifies the handing down from one generation to the next of life's spiritual and fertile core. These are the Bimin Kuskusmen, and their ritual cannibalism is a central and positive element in their public life.
It's entirely designed in what I have witnessed, which has to do exclusively with funerals, to recycle the spiritual essence of the dead within the clan so that it's not lost.
University of California anthropologist Fitz John Poole lived with the tribe for 3 years. He is one of the few living witnesses of ritual cannibalism.
They do not think of the consumption of human flesh as eating in an ordinary fashion. It's, and I use the term hesitantly because it has so many Western connotations, it's a sacrament. It's not a meal.
Poole says gender and kinship relations all play an important part in the ritual. When a father dies, his eldest son has a moral obligation to eat a tiny piece of his dead father's genitals. The father's other male relatives honor him by eating morsels of his bone marrow, considered a male substance. His female relatives believe they enhance their reproductive power by eating tiny bits of his lower belly fat, considered a female substance. After a mother's death, her eldest daughter eats a minute fragment of her mother's genitals. Although the Bimin Kuskusmen have maintained this form of cannibalism for hundreds of years, even they are occasionally revolted by the experience.
It's well understood that the obligation is, in a sense, very unpalatable in psychological terms. So people will admit that sometimes, although they ought not to do this at all, they will fake it, in effect. They will palm a bit of flesh, throw it away in the forest, hide it under a leaf, or something of that kind. Some people have a more dramatic reaction where people actually did ingest it and then vomited.
Despite this occasional squeamishness, cannibalism is considered a valued religious rite in which the participants symbolically eat the body of their ancestors so that the powers of one generation may be passed to the next. The Bimin Couscousmin regard any cannibalistic practices which do not adhere to their standards of propriety and etiquette as appalling. While they deem their cannibalism appropriate, they view the nearby Myanmar tribe as real cannibals and condemn them for their subhuman traditions. It's an example of how cannibalism is used, even among cannibals, as a powerful tool of negative propaganda. Anthropologists say that describing a rival culture as cannibalistic demonizes it.
Canaan is a region in the ancient Near East during the late 2nd millennium BC situated in the southern Levant. The setting comprises regions of Phoenicia, Philistia, and parts which would later be known as Israel. Canaan had significant geopolitical importance in the late Bronze Age Amarna period as the area where the spheres of interest of the Egyptian, Hittite, and Assyrian empires converged. Knowledge of Canaan from archaeological sources is almost exclusively from artifacts dated to the period in which the region existed under the hegemony of the New Kingdom of Egypt. Israelite religion is one which originated out of these Bronze Age polytheistic ancient Semitic religious traditions, specifically the Canaanite religion. It exhibits a syncretization with elements from Babylonian religion as well as some Egyptian influences.
To determine if this jar contains a 6,000-year-old baby, archaeologists must send it through a CT scan.
Wow, יפהפייה, איזה גולגולת, פנטסטי. כאן אנחנו רואים את הגולגולת, כאן זה עמוד השדרה, והצלעות הן פה וכאן זה האגן.
It's the first step in determining if this child was sacrificed. One of the greatest tales of sacrifice comes from the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. The book of Genesis tells us that Abraham is God's most loyal follower. In return for his faith, God promises to make Abraham the father of many nations. It goes against all his spiritual beliefs. Abraham faces an impossible choice.
Bimin Couscousmin regard any cannibalistic practices which do not adhere to their standards of propriety and etiquette as appalling. While they deem their cannibalism appropriate, they view the nearby Myanmar tribe as real cannibals and condemn them for their subhuman traditions.
Accusation of cannibalism against others allows society to define itself as being somehow intellectually, morally, culturally superior to their neighbors.
He must sacrifice his beloved son or defy his God. Our possible sacrificial child comes from some of the earliest ancient settlements in the Holy Land of Abraham, at a place called Fetzael. 6,000 years ago, this land was known as Canaan. According to biblical tradition, at the time Canaanites were living here, their tribes paid tributes to many gods with offerings of goats, sheep, and grain, and sometimes children.
Say that they settled some of the remnants in either Egypt itself or in Canaan. And we know that later Egyptian texts talk about the city of Dor in Israel being a Tejeker city. We know that the Peleset settled down in Canaan. They become the Philistines. The Greeks, we get new political systems and new civilizations in effect. The Greeks rise up and we get things that will eventually become democracies. We know we get the Israelites and David and Solomon, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which may not have been able to exist unless the mighty kingdoms of the late Bronze Age had been done away with.
Anthropologists say that describing a rival culture as cannibalistic demonizes it.
I think the subject of cannibalism is one of those classic instances which tells you more about the culture that is writing the documents than about the culture being studied.
Let him come to me.
Israelites did not like the Canaanite system, and they defined themselves in contrast to that system. So by not using decorated pottery, by not using important pottery, they developed an ideology of simplicity, which marked the difference between them and the Egyptian Canaanite system.
The ancient city of Carthage was the capital of the Phoenician Empire, one of the most advanced civilizations of their time. But recent archaeological expeditions have revealed another notable feature: the incredibly high incidence of child sacrifice. Altars on which children were sacrificed and stone markers, which mark the burial place of their remains, have been uncovered, along with the stone carvings on the markers that depict the children who were sacrificed. Clay jars were used to hold the remains. Burial grounds full of thousands of these ritually sacrificed children have been unearthed. The Carthaginians were descendants of the ancient Canaanites and worshiped the same god, Baal or Moloch. Archaeologists have established that the primary deity that the children were sacrificed to was the goddess Tanit, the name being a regional representation of the more universal Ashtaroth. Written accounts tell us that the priests of Baal would beat drums during the ritual sacrifice in order to drown out the cries of the grieving mothers. As barbaric as all this sounds, we must remember that we are doing much the same thing to abortion, with one obvious exception. Today, we don't commemorate or bury the children we sacrifice.
But archaeologists have also discovered that over Carthage's history, the incidence of child sacrifice, even in the face of considerable intellectual advancement, actually increased until it finally stopped.
And how did it end? Roman armies invaded and destroyed the entire civilization, going so far as to cover the ground with vast amounts of salt so that the land could no longer be cultivated.
It's a marvel that the gospel came in the first century when Roman roads, Roman peace, Roman justice, Roman language had spread throughout the Mediterranean world and paved the way for the gospel. This was already beginning in God's providence with Rome's tenacity in protection of home and horror at the brutality of the pagan nations around them. Now, to be sure, ancient Rome, prior to its acceptance of Christianity, was still brutal. Augustine points this out in The City of God. But it was uniquely prepared in ways that we can't even measure today. By God's good providence, through the war with Carthage, called the Punic Wars. It was a long period of multiple conflicts on sea and land for the control of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were the old Phoenicians transplanted to North Africa, and they had a particularly brutal faith that was rooted in the old deities of the Canaanites, brought from the cities of the plain, the Philistines, and ultimately transported to North Africa. As a result, all of the horrors that we read about in the Old Testament, the Asherahs, the Baals, the Molechs, the worship of demons, this was at the heart and soul of Carthaginian culture. When the Romans encountered this, really for the first time in the Punic Wars, they were shocked into the realization of the roots of the old pagan world. They desired to set themselves apart as something different.
Sacred, or temple prostitution, is a sexual ritual consisting of intercourse or other erotic activity performed in the context of religious worship. Scholars have long considered such practices to be customary in the ancient world, but some prefer the term sacred sex to sacred prostitution in cases where a payment for service was not involved.
Ancient Near Eastern societies along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers featured many shrines and temples, or ziggurats, dedicated to various deities. According to the 5th century BC historian Herodotus, the rites performed at these temples included sacred sex rites, and I quote, "The foulest Babylonian custom is that which compels every woman of the land to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have intercourse with some stranger at least once in her life. Most sit down in the sacred plot of Aphrodite, by which the men pass and make their choice, and once a woman has taken her place there, she does not go away to her home before some stranger has cast money into her lap and had intercourse with her outside the temple. But while he casts the money, he must say, 'I invite you in the name of my Lisa.' It does not matter what the sum of money is, the woman will never refuse, for that would be a sin. The money being by this act made sacred. So she follows the first man who casts it and rejects no one. After their intercourse, having discharged her sacred duty to the goddess, she goes away to her home, and thereafter there is no bribe, however great, that will get her. So then the women that are fair are soon free, but the uncomely have long to wait, because they cannot fulfill the law, for some of them remain for 3 years or 4. So in other words, in ancient Babylon, it was a sexual right expected of every woman, no matter how wealthy her family was, to prostitute herself at least once, and for the females that were not attractive, according to Herodotus, this could potentially take years to fulfill. The Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer. Kings in the ancient Near Eastern region of Sumer established their legitimacy by taking part in ritual sexual acts in the temple of Ishtar every year on the 10th day.
In fact, it is estimated that 1/2 of all children born in Carthage were ultimately given over to this ritual infanticide slaughter. There were whole sepulchres filled with the bodies of infant children that the Romans discovered when they came and conquered Carthage. It was one of the reasons, and this is rarely discussed by historians, although it's oftentimes listed, it's one of the reasons why the Romans were so brutal in plowing under the city of Carthage and salting the earth. It was their intention that never again would the specter of this kind of awful brutality, this unnatural destruction of your own seed, sweep across the earth again. And interestingly, we note that many of the infanticide walls in Roman military outposts disappeared after the Punic Wars. It so sickened the Romans who actually fought for the liberty of the Republic and ultimately the Empire. They were so sickened by what they saw in Carthage that they rid their own practices of the last remnants of infanticide. The great general who crossed the Alps with his famous elephants was a brilliant general, but he was the bearer of that old, ancient, pagan religion of Baal and Molech. The Romans, not yet Christian, saw the horror of retreating in history and thus fought tooth and nail to hold off Hannibal's brilliant assaults. The result was that Roman culture was left in a kind of no man's land, where spiritually they were left to build up the roads, build up the language, the communication, the network that ultimately the gospel would run on, and run literally to the ends of the earth just a few generations later.
To dehumanize an enemy culture in times of war, and in times of peace, elevate their own purportedly modern society over others they considered primeval.
The accusation of cannibalism against others allows society to define itself as being somehow intellectually, morally, culturally superior to their neighbors.
If the Israelites wanted to distinguish themselves from their Canaanite past, what better way than to create a story about destroying them? Celebrate the power of what the Bible says is the foremost distinction between the Israelites and all other people. And Joshua conquering Canaan from outside. The answer may lie in their desire to forge a distinctly new identity.
Identity is created, as psychologists tell us, by talking about what you are not, by talking about another. In order to figure out who I am, I have to figure out who I am not.
Conspicuously absent from Israelite villages are the grand palaces and the extravagant pottery associated with the kings and rich elites of Canaan. The stories of Abraham, Exodus, and the conquest serve another purpose. They celebrate the power of what the Bible says is the foremost distinction between the Israelites and all other people: their God. In later Judaism, the name of God is considered so sacred it is never to be spoken.
We don't know exactly what it means. We don't know how it was pronounced, but it seems to have been the personal name of the God of Israel. So his title, in a sense, was God, and his name was these 4 letters, which in English would be YHWH, which we think were probably pronounced something like Yahweh.
The religion began as a henotheistic offshoot of the Canaanite worship of El, along with his secondary epithet, Yahweh, which refers to El Yahweh Sabaoth, often translated as Lord of Hosts, which likely means El who creates the armies. El, who was the supreme god of the Mesopotamian Semites, later became the chief god of the Hebrew Bible. In Canaan, he was known to be the father and the ruler of the divines, as well as the creator. The god of the Jews evolved gradually from the Canaanite El, who was the high god of the pantheon, to the Israelite El, who is likewise the chief god of the Hebrews. The essential qualities of the Canaanite El were retained in the God of the Hebrews. Over time, the Israelite group of Canaanites converged the sky gods El and his son Baal-Hadad, and El was conflated as Yahweh. There was a push towards monolatry, the worship of one god among many, but not necessarily denying the existence of other gods, which made it so that the Israelites' focus on El Yahweh compelled them to make it appear that there was a greater divide between Yahweh and the older god, Baal.
The search for the origins of Yahweh leads scholars back to ancient Egypt. The royal city of Karnak, for over 1,000 years, pharaohs celebrated their power with statues, obelisks, and carved murals on temples.
Here on the north wall of Karnak, we have scenes depicting the victories in battle of Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great. Seti here commemorates one of his greatest victories over the Shasu.
The Shasu were a people who lived in the deserts of southern Canaan, now Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia, at around the same time as the Israelites emerged. Egyptian texts say one of the places where the Shasu lived is called YHW, probably pronounced Yahu, likely the name of their patron god. That name Yahu is strangely similar to Yahweh, the name of the Israelite god. In the Bible, the place where the Shasu lived is referred to as Midian. It is here, before the Exodus, the Bible tells us Moses first encounters Yahweh in the form of a burning bush.
Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations."
Something that appears to be a name like Yahweh in the vicinity of Midian. Here is Moses in Midian, and there a deity appears to him and reveals his name to Moses as Yahweh.
These tantalizing connections are leading biblical scholars to re-examine the Exodus story. While there is no evidence to support a mass migration, some now believe that a small group did escape from Egypt. However, they were not Israelites, but rather Canaanite slaves. On their journey back to Canaan, they pass through Midian, where they are inspired by stories of the Shasu's god, Yahu.
There was probably a group of people who fled from Egypt and had some divine experience. It was probably a small group demographically, but it was important, at least in ideology.
They find their way to the central hill country, where they encounter the tribes who had fled the Canaanite city-states. Their story of deliverance resonates in this emerging egalitarian society. The liberated slaves attribute their freedom to the God they met in Midian, who they now call Yahweh.
They spread the word to the highlanders, who themselves perhaps had escaped from the tyranny of the Canaanite city-states. They spread the idea of a God who represented freedom, freedom for people to keep the fruits of their own labor. This was a message that was so powerful that it brought people together and gave them a new kind of identity.
The identity of Israelites. They are a combination of disenfranchised Canaanites, runaway slaves from Egypt, and even nomads settling down. The Bible calls them a mixed multitude. First is Abraham, who leaves Mesopotamia with his family and journeys to the Promised Land, Canaan.
The Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great." Genesis 12:1 and 2.
They will be fruitful, multiply, and inhabit all the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia.
God, in our sense, doesn't exist before Abraham.
It is hard to appreciate today how radical an idea this must have been in a world dominated by polytheism, the worship of many gods and idols. The Abraham narrative is part of the first book of the Bible, Genesis, along with Noah and the flood and Adam and Eve. Though they convey a powerful message, to date, there is no archaeology or text outside of the Bible to corroborate them.
The farther back you go in the biblical text, the more difficult it is to find historical material in it. The patriarchs go back to Genesis. Genesis is, for the most part, a compilation of myths, creation stories, things like that. And to find a historical core there is very difficult.
This absence of historical evidence leads scholars to take a different approach to reading the biblical narrative. They look beyond our modern notion of fact or fiction to ask why the Bible was written in the first place.
There is no word for history in the Hebrew Bible. The biblical writers were telling stories. They were good historians, and they could tell it the way it was when they wanted to, but their objective was always something far beyond that.
In fact, within the first 5 books of the Bible, scholars have identified the hand of at least 4 different groups of scribes, writing over several hundred years. This theory is called the documentary hypothesis.
One way of thinking about it is as a kind of anthology that was made over the course of many centuries by different people, adding to it, subtracting from it, and so forth.
But when did the process of writing the Bible begin?
Was not a random scratching of 2 or 3 letters. It was the full alphabet. Everything about it says that this is the ancestor of the Hebrew script.
The Tel Zayit Abecedary is the earliest Hebrew alphabet ever discovered. It dates to about 1000 BC, making it possible that writing the Hebrew Bible could have already started by this time. To discover the most ancient text in the Bible, scholars examine the Hebrew spelling, grammar, and vocabulary.
The Hebrew Bible is a collection of literature written over about 1,000 years. And as with any other language, Hebrew naturally changed quite a bit over those 1,000 years.
Scholars examine the Bible in its original Hebrew in search of the most archaic language, and therefore the oldest passages.
Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers are drowned in the Red Sea.
The climactic scene of Exodus, the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt, and how Moses leads them to freedom. In all of the Bible, no single event is mentioned more times than the Exodus. With the development of ancient Hebrew script, the Song of the Sea could have been written by 1000 BC, the time of Tappy's alphabet. But it was probably recited as a poem long before the beginning of Hebrew writing.
It's very likely that it was a kind of story told in poetic form that you might tell around the campfire. Just as our poems are easier to remember generally than prose accounts. So we generally think that the poetry is orally passed on from one to another long before they commit things to writing.
Only specific item mentioned in the Exodus story that we can probably connect with non-biblical material is the cities that the Hebrews were ordered to build, and they are named Pithom and Ramses.
Scholars agree that the biblical city Ramses is the ancient Egyptian city Piramesi. It could not have happened before Ramses became king around 1275 BC. And it could not have happened after 1208 BC, when the stela of Pharaoh Merneptah, Ramses II's son, specifically locates the Israelites in Canaan. The Bible says the Israelites leave Egypt in a mass migration, 600,000 men and their families, and then wander in the desert for 40 years. But even assuming the Bible is exaggerating, in 100 years of searching, archaeologists have not yet found evidence of migration that can be linked to the Exodus.
No excavated site gives us any information about the route of the wandering through the wilderness. An exodus is simply not attested anywhere.
Any historical or archaeological confirmation of the Exodus remains elusive.
There's no way out. There's no civilization. There's absolutely no way to call. And if you're stuck, you don't survive. It's as simple as that. You can survive for 2 days or 3 days, and then you don't. That's it. You're finished.
Be anywhere from 2 to 6 million people. The population of Egypt at around 1200 to 1500 BC was around 7 million people. So that means that this would be a large chunk of the population. Anywhere between 25 and 75% of the population of Egypt was picking up and leaving. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of Hebrew slaves in Egypt. There is no evidence of anyone buying one. There's no evidence of anyone selling one. There's no evidence of anyone bragging about tomb walls of how many they own. So if you're looking for the Hebrews in Egypt, you're not going to find them. The next problem with finding evidence is the Sinai Desert itself. The Sinai Desert is very, very dry. It hasn't rained there in about 11,000 years. They can tell where Bedouins have camped overnight thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. So if 2 million people were going through the Sinai, there would be evidence that they would have left behind. The first would be the most simple ones. There would be latrines, there would be dead bodies, there would be dead animals, there would be kitchens. There would be things that normal people would do on the way there. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that 2 million people, or even 200,000 people, or even 2,000 people had gone through the desert in this way. There is no latrines, there is no kitchens, there is no dead bodies. If 2 million people had gone through Sinai, that would be double the population of Rome at its height.
Yet scholars have discovered that all 4 groups of biblical writers contributed to some part of the Exodus story. Perhaps it is for the same reason its message remains powerful to this day. Its inspiring theme of freedom.
Freedom is a compelling notion, and that is one of the ways that we can understand the story of the Exodus, from being controlled by others to controlling oneself. The idea of a change from domination to autonomy, that these are very powerful ideas that resonate in the human spirit. And the Exodus gives narrative reality to those ideas.
They deemed their cannibalism appropriate. They view the nearby Myanmar tribe as real cannibals and condemn them for their subhuman traditions. It's an example of how cannibalism is used, even among cannibals, as a powerful tool of negative propaganda. Anthropologists say that describing a rival culture as cannibalistic demonizes it.
Following the Exodus, the Bible says God finally delivers the Israelites to the promised land, Canaan. Archaeology and sources outside the Bible reveal that Canaan consisted of well-fortified city-states, each with its own king, who in turn served Egypt and its pharaoh. The Canaanites, a thriving Near Eastern culture for thousands of years, worshipped many gods in the form of idols.
We will not live by your commandments. We're free.
There is no freedom without the law.
Whose law, Moses? Yours? Did you carve those tablets to become a prince over us?
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me.
Moses! 15,000 skeletal remains, 500 with signs of violent death, another 300 butchered and consumed. In all, 1 in 50 were victims of cannibalism. Cases included men, women, children, and even the unborn. So who was responsible for these brutal acts, and why did they occur? As investigators sought to make sense of the data, there were several possible answers. One was warfare. According to Harvard archaeologist Stephen LeBlanc, there's evidence of warfare throughout the ancient Southwest.
People were really being killed. There really were massacres.
But during the 2.5 centuries of the Chaco phenomenon, things were different.
You have this fairly long period of 800 to 1,000 years, up to about 900 AD, with sort of this chronic, intermittent warfare. And then, just almost suddenly, it stops. Then you see this period of about 200, 250 years with virtually no warfare. So it's this 200-year interval that's really so enigmatic.
Although it was a time of peace, that's precisely the time when cannibalism did occur. War, then, was not a factor. Still, LeBlanc did some gruesome calculations.
The average event seems to represent maybe 5 or 7 people, but some of them seem to represent perhaps 30 people. And those are the ones that are hardest to explain. That the number of people that it would have taken to have consumed 30 individuals is really staggering, maybe 200 to 400 people. You try to compute just how much meat would have been consumed in one of these events. It turns out to be hundreds of pounds of meat.
That's too many people and too much food at any one time for the starvation theory to make sense. So cannibalism could be ruled out as a source of food and for warfare. What was left? The mystery continued until Turner and his colleagues began to notice a pattern, and 2/3 show signs of cannibalism. Almost 90% of the cases were committed either in or near the Chacoan Great Houses. It was a major breakthrough.
It was something like nothing had occurred here in the Southwest previously. This is so big. But when I look at this stuff, I see something here that is so much bigger than local evolution could possibly have produced. This is something that came in here. I have to have a mechanism to bring this cannibalism into the Southwest, okay?
Turner was looking for something more concrete than signs of Mesoamerican influence in the architecture. He needed evidence of the people themselves who had come up from the south.
Sacrifice to Aztec gods.
Aztec culture involved human sacrifice. Evidence indicates the Aztecs may have been murdering as many as 20,000 victims a year.
And because of that, finds like these aren't extremely rare. Skull has been found among the human skulls used for a sacrificial rack. 2 women's skulls were also among the recent discovery.
In the Valley of Mexico and throughout Mesoamerica, people modify their teeth by chipping, filing, inlaying, drilling them and doing all kinds of things to them. So if we have got some individuals here in the Southwest with dental modification, the odds are very good that they're from Mexico, because there is no tradition of tooth modification in California, the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountains, the Southwest, the Great Plains, you name it.
Re-examining the bones from here at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon for the 5th time, Turner discovered what he was looking for, a single filed tooth.
I think we've got the direct link between Mesoamerica and the Southwest. So, what do I say? I've got a Mexican over here someplace with chipped teeth. I've got cannibalism in 3 or 4 rooms somewhere around here. I see Mexico.
The connection that Turner sees is found in today's Mexico City, once the capital of a vast Mesoamerican empire. Here, the remnants of an ancient culture offer an explanation to the source of cannibalism in Chaco Canyon. These are the ruins of Templo Mayor, an immense ceremonial complex of stepped temples and their altars. It was the religious heart of a culture with a deep reverence for ritual sacrifice and even the ritual consumption of human beings. The stones are adorned with sculptures, deities fierce and demanding, serpent gods, forces of the universe needing to be appeased. The god and goddess of death were idols with exposed ribs and sliced organs. Aztec records attest to this cult of blood. In surviving codices, there are images of sacrifice and consumption, stories of dismemberment, decapitation, and bodies being boiled. Early Spanish records report gruesome ceremonies in which thousands of captives at a time were bent backwards over this dark stone slab and sacrificed to voracious gods. The still beating hearts of victims would have been deposited in this ceremonial vessel. Parts of the bodies were recorded as having been consumed by priests and other elites, investing them, they thought, with godlike qualities. The rest may have been sold in the marketplace.
Afterwards put on a pole as a trophy.
And they weren't just single trophies. Carefully punching holes in the sides of the skull, the Mesoamericans would run a pole through and string many skulls together. In one find, a skull rack consisted of 170 skulls. The purpose was clear: to frighten and subjugate all those who might oppose them and crush dissent. But just before the beginning of the Chaco era, a time of great civil anarchy rocked this world. It's known that many fled the Valley of Mexico. The crux of Turner's theory is that a small cult came north, traveling up to Chaco Canyon, carrying their bloody beliefs with them. He believes that when this fierce group encountered the Anasazi, they found a peaceful, pliant people who were easy to subjugate. According to Turner, the Mesoamerican cult set out to recreate the same system they had left behind, a culture of intimidation and social control.
They needed some kind of weapon, and certainly cannibalism would serve as a weapon. You don't have to kill a lot of people to make your point. And they use cannibalism as a threat. It's a terrifying thing. We're afraid of it ourselves. I mean, the revulsion we have is in part because we can imagine ourselves being consumed. And I can imagine word getting out that we've got cannibals in our midst would bring about a lot of social control with very, very little effort.
In my mind, is the strongest hypothesis we have. If it's people treating other people as though they're animals and butchering them in the same way that you would an animal, and even consuming the result, that you know, that probably is intended to send a political message. Warning, it's a warning.
This reign of terror lasted for at least 2.5 centuries. But somewhere about 1150 AD, things began to change. Environmental conditions took a turn for the worse, and the Chaco system fell apart. The evidence in the bones shows that cannibalism also began to wane at just this time. But it's likely that it was more than just the harsh conditions at work. Perhaps the ancient inhabitants finally turned away from cannibalism and from this place itself. There is an old Native American story that Chaco was a place of evil, that something terrible happened there, that this evil threw the world out of balance.
The Bible describes how a new leader, Joshua, takes the Israelites into Canaan in a blitzkrieg military campaign.
So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat.
But what does archaeology say? In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang excavated at Jericho, declared he had found the very walls that Joshua had brought tumbling down. And at what the Bible describes as the greatest of all Canaanite cities, Hatzor, there is more evidence of destruction. They discover it occurred about 2200 BC. They date the destruction of Jericho to 1500 BC. And Hatzor's to about 1250 BC. Clearly, these city-states were not destroyed at the same time. They range over nearly 1,000 years. In fact, of the 31 sites the Bible says that Joshua conquered, few showed any signs of war.
There was no evidence of armed conflict in most of these sites. At the same time, it was discovered that most of the large Canaanite towns that were supposed to have been destroyed by these Israelites were either not destroyed at all or destroyed by others.
A single sweeping military invasion led by Joshua cannot account for how the Israelites arrived in Canaan. The destruction of Hatzor does coincide with the time that the Merneptah Stela locates the Israelites in Canaan. So who destroyed Hatzor?
The final destruction itself consisted of the mutilation of statues of kings and gods. It did not consist of signs of war or of any kind of fighting. We don't see weapons in the street like we see in other sites that were destroyed by foreigners.
So if there was no invasion, what happened? Excavations reveal that Hatzor had a lower city of commoners, serfs and slaves, and an upper city with a king and wealthy elites. Zuckerman finds within the grand palaces of elite Hatzor areas of disrepair and abandonment. To archaeologists, signs of a culture in decline and rebellion from within.
Ahrens believes that historically, societies have used rumors about cannibalism to dehumanize an enemy culture in times of war.
I would not rule out the possibility of an internal revolt of Canaanites living at Hatzor and revolting against the elites that rule the city.
In fact, the entire Canaanite city-state system, including Hatzor and Jericho, breaks down.
David and Solomon did not rule over a big territory. It was a small chiefdom, if you wish, with just a few settlements, very poor, the population was limited, there was no manpower for big conquests and so on and so forth.
Have to be redated. This places them in the time of the lesser-known kings Omri, Ahab, and his despised wife Jezebel, all worshippers of the Canaanite god Baal. With no writing or monumental building, the kingdom of David and Solomon is far less glorious than the Bible describes.
Using these pagan symbols, they evolved into being projected on what would be considered something evil. There's something about the fusing of the animal and the human that is terrifying to us. It represents something that we fear might be inside of us, this animalistic side that wants to devour and kill.
Dante is a great example of the power of a compelling story. He creates this elaborate hell, and then, 1,000 years later, we're all taking this as kind of religious canon. And that's because it's good storytelling, and it's great detail, and it resonates with us kind of emotionally. And so we take it and we assume that it's always been true.
Something that would surprise a lot of Christians, never mind non-Christians, is that the term hell never appears in the Bible. Instead, what biblical translators did was use the term hell as a stand-in for other words. It's a catch-all term to describe the bad place people might end up when they die.
It seems to me that in some ways, we find the idea of eternal torment to be more comforting than not knowing what might happen, or even worse, the fear that afterward there might be nothing.
But none are as powerful as Satan. So where did people first get the idea of an ultimate evil being? 3,500 years ago, in ancient Persia, where Syria, Iraq, and Iran are now, there were many gods, good and evil, until one man, a religious teacher called Zoroaster, reduced the whole complicated cast of characters to two.
Zoroaster is a revolutionary, primarily because he, in one sense, personifies these ethical categories into a good god, Ahura Mazda, and a bad god, Ahriman. And this is an extremely potent idea and one which forms the basis for later conceptions of dualistic thought, in other words, the separation between good and evil.
The good god is the all-knowing Ahura Mazda, the god of light and order. The evil god is Ahriman, god of chaos, darkness, and lies. In Zoroaster's teachings, the universe is a battlefield between the gods of good and evil, and every person on earth must take sides. After death, good people are rewarded in heaven, while sinners are punished in a dark and gloomy hell. Under the powerful Persian emperor Darius the Great, the teachings of Zoroaster become the official religion of the Persian Empire, an empire which includes the lands of Israel.
You get a clear demarcation of what we would call Jewish ideas, okay, and we can spot the Zoroastrian ideas in the Old Testament. They are there, notions of heaven and hell. Okay? The beginning of actually seeing the devil personified as the fierce opponent of God.
In a famous myth, Zeus, the greatest of the gods, defeats the winged serpent Typhon and throws him down to Tartarus, the lowest region of the underworld. Over the following centuries, the myth grows into the story of how the angel Satan rebels against God and is thrown out of heaven with all his followers. Satan's allies, the fallen angels, become his legion of demons.
When tales of cannibalism were spread by the first explorers and missionaries, many people were skeptical. But the stories were more than myth. Eating human flesh was a common practice among many tribes until it was outlawed in the 1950s. But not all cannibalism is alike. A cannibal meal in New Guinea could be a victory celebration or a funeral feast. Robert Klitzman, a clinical psychiatrist, has studied the Foray tribe in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea.
There are two forms of cannibalism, both endocannibalism, when one eats those from within one's group, and exocannibalism, when one eats those from outside one's group. And the Foray, of course, were endocannibals, since they consumed just members of their tribe, in this case their loved ones. When someone in the Foray group died, the body would be cut, parts would be wrapped in banana leaves or in bamboo tubes and steamed and then consumed.
Cannibalism was a way of honoring the dearly departed, but it may have had a more practical purpose as well. Among the Foray, only the men were allowed to enjoy feasts of roast pig, and pigs were not always plentiful. But human bodies were a good source of protein and an important supplement for the women and children. For the Foray, of course, the custom had a different objective.
When I talked to people about it, one woman, for instance, told me, this way I'll always have part of my mother inside of me. And in some ways, it's been said, the group's cemeteries were their stomachs.
Cannibalism was a common practice among the Foray and other tribes until the middle of this century. It was an accepted part of life, nothing to be ashamed of. Even years later, former cannibals were still quite willing to talk about it to outsiders, and they described the practice in precise detail. As in any culinary tradition, there were established techniques for food preparation and individual preferences based on habit and taste. In the late 1950s, when anthropologist Shirley Lindenbaum began studying the Foray, she was able to learn much about their customs and their recipes.
The Foray women said it was just very sweet and delicious, and they ate all parts of the body, and they frequently dug up bodies to eat them after they were interred, and there was something aggressive about the way women went back after the men had buried the bodies. They sometimes thought it was better to leave the body in the ground for a little while until there were maggots in it, and then it was more delicious.
Before the establishment of colonial rule in the 1930s and 40s, cannibalism was widely practiced. But with the arrival of outsiders and the introduction of Christianity, the tradition was largely stamped out. For tribes like the Foray, cannibalism slowly passed into history. But other tribes ate the dead for a different reason.
Exocannibalism is considered to be eating of people who do not belong to your own group, eating of enemies. It's usually associated with warring and dominance, certainly, frequently associated with headhunting.
One tribe that practiced exocannibalism was the Asmat. They were the model for our Western stereotype of the New Guinea headhunters, notorious for eating the enemy warriors they killed.
We've got a baby's arm bone, that's a newborn 4-month-old baby. That is possibly stillborn.
Or premature.
Diana Good, an osteologist or bone artifact specialist, immediately recognizes these fragments as newborn babies because of their size and structure. It's a rare find to make at an archaeological site. It's also chilling. Mixed in with the infants are more butchered animal remains.
We've got domestic dog, then we've got wild, and we've got wild deer.
On closer examination, the infant bones also appear to have been butchered.
And it's a baby.
There is one more clue that makes Taylor suspect this is the location of a cannibalistic feast.
We've got some stones like this which have been heated. These are often known as pot boilers. They could have been used for pit roasting or for putting into a leather bag with meat.
Infant bones, adult bones, and animal bones, all butchered and found with stones used for cooking. The findings evoke a brutal event here at Kinsey Caves.
I think that these are the remains of a meal or a number of meals in which all of that has been cooked together as a stew with human and domesticated meat in it. Looks to me like a real ethnic conflict, something that is very, very aggressive.
Date to around 3900 BC, the oldest identified human bones in the north of England. It was a critical time in history when late Stone Age hunters, known as mesoliths, first came in contact with England's earliest farmers. Mesoliths, who began to inhabit England around 9000 BC, were hunter-gatherers who roamed the countryside. Around 4000 BC, farmers from the south began to colonize the region. These people became known as Neoliths. They were more advanced than the mesoliths, raising livestock and living in villages, and building monuments, like Stonehenge. Taylor and other experts believe that it would have been a time of conflict between the two groups.
That's what makes this site so important, because it is actually on the cusp, and they may indeed be fighting each other over territory to keep it as hunting or to convert it to farming.
This is the first evidence found in England of cannibalism being associated with this time period.
These hunters in the hills are feeling really threatened. They know that the farming people are coming, that farming is coming. They can see that that's going to mean loss of habitat, the loss of a way of life, and they are not going to give up without a fight.
Taylor theorizes that the mesoliths were terrorizing the neoliths by killing and eating their babies.
I imagine those children have been killed. The chop mark on the inside of the tiny baby's rib shows it's been chopped up pretty much like you would chop up an animal. They're killing humans, they're eating babies.
The eventual dominance of the Neolithic culture over the mesoliths marked the end of the hunter-gatherers in England forever. This site may represent a desperate attempt to hold on to the old ways.
Has long been observed among the Foray tribe in Papua New Guinea. Like mad cow disease, it's caused by cannibalism. In the 1950s, the Foray were nearly wiped out by this bizarre illness. Even long after cannibalism was outlawed, many Foray were still coming down with the deadly disease. They call it kuru, which in their language means to tremble. Robert Klitzman has studied the causes and long-term effects of the epidemic.
Well, kuru takes about a year from when someone first gets symptoms to when they die of the disease. And usually the first thing is you'll notice some unsteadiness in their gait when they're trying to walk. That'll progress to soon they'll have difficulty walking without the aid of a stick. Their hands and feet will begin to tremble, thus the name kuru. soon they'll have difficulty getting around at all and really have to sort of just remain seated. Eventually they sort of end up just lying down and soon dying. The other symptoms are dementia, which develops, where they have forgetfulness. And early in the epidemic, some patients were found and described as laughing, as having sort of inappropriate laughter. And the press, the media gave the name the laughing death for the disease.
Kuru was a familiar disease, but for many years its causes were a mystery. When anthropologist Shirley Lindenbaum traveled to Papua New Guinea in the early 1960s, most scientists assumed Kuru was a genetic disorder.
Robert Glass and I proposed the theory of cannibal transmission about 1962 and 1963.
Carlton Gajdusek would win a Nobel Prize for pinpointing the disease-causing agent. Further research proved that Kuru was indeed transmitted from one human to another by cannibalism, specifically by eating the brains of those who had died of the disease. Some of the victims had eaten human flesh when they were young children, but only exhibited the first symptoms of Kuru 30 years later. A condition similar to Kuru has been well documented in the Western world. It's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, and it strikes 1 out of every 1 million people.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Kuru are caused by an infectious protein that gets other proteins to flip the wrong way, and soon crystals form of protein in brain cells, leading to the death of the brain cell and eventually to holes forming in the brain, so the brain looks like sponge. The disease is roughly similar to what happens with Kuru. First, one has some shakiness. It will progress first to people losing the ability to speak and take care of themselves and eat, later to dementia, and eventually to death.
In the early 1990s, Great Britain was struck by a new form of CJD. It was a variant of mad cow disease that was now killing people as well as livestock. Humans were contracting this disease by eating beef from infected cattle.
Also, all the other ideas in the poem about what it is to be human as opposed to being an animal, what it is to be human as opposed to being a god, what it is to be a king. All these ideas demonstrate a great intellect at work who knows how to embed thoughts about the human condition into a great story drawn from folklore.
Told the people what the rules are. You know, it's the same thing as a church, and all the things we got that make us a community that we all believe in and share is what they use to go from a family to a tribe, and from a tribe to a city, and then to a country.
So I think we have got then a message from the poem. I don't think the poem was created to give us that message, but I think the interest of the last poet of Gilgamesh was very much in using the story of Gilgamesh as a vehicle for understanding the human condition. And out of it, then we get this idea coming very strongly that what the individual does is not important. The important thing is the community, the society of human beings.
Star Wars, I had an idea to do this kind of film. I was curious, just an idea I had about psychological motifs that are in mythology, and if they're still accurate today, because the great thing about mythology is an oral medium up until they learned how to write. But before that, with Homer and everybody, they would just tell the story. They go to people's houses, tell the story, get a free dinner, and that's how they made their livings. And then it passed down from father to son, father to son.
And this, I think, explains why the great epic of Gilgamesh, 4,000 years old, when it was rediscovered and became known generally to more than Assyriologists in the early 20th century, it took off and took on a life of its own, and has been the inspiration of artists and musicians and librettists and dramatists and poets who have not stayed faithful to the epic of Gilgamesh, but created Gilgamesh among us. And of course, Assyriologists hate this because we think we are the gatekeepers of the epic of Gilgamesh. And if you are going to engage with the Epic of Gilgamesh, you should do it through our work. But of course it's too late. The cat got out of the bag a long time ago. Thank you very much for listening.
I said, I wonder if people still think the way they thought then. And I think I proved that they do, because the psychological motifs are the same. I mean, it's this kind of thing, even though it's not in Star Wars, but when you're telling a story that there's a boring part and everybody's sleeping, you say, well, let's cut that out. And so you do, and then you say, well, this thing about where he falls in love with his mother and then he wants to kill his father, everybody likes that part. So then you keep that part in. You know, and they didn't really know what they were doing. They were just getting responses from the audience. And it wasn't until Freud came along that people realized that, oh, these are psychological motifs that have been around for a long time. And they're just as strong today.
But it's a lot about good and evil. It's a lot about heroes.
It's about good and evil. But heroes, what makes a hero? What's friendship? What's the idea of sacrificing yourself for something larger? They're all really basic things. They say, well, we don't have to make a movie about that. It's very obvious. But it's actually not. It's not that obvious to a lot of people unless you have somebody tell you every generation that this is what our country believes in. So this is what we believe in. And with Star Wars, it was, you know, the religion, everything was so taken and put into a form that was easy for everybody to accept, so it didn't fall into a contemporary mode where you could argue about it. It went everywhere in the world because they could say, oh, the things I believe in are the same as that. Most people in the world believe exactly the same thing.
They share the same.
They share the same beliefs.
They want to do well by their children. They want to live a good life.
It's something that I came up, the idea of why do we think the way we think? Why do we do what we do? Why do we form our society the way we find it? It was something I did when I was about 8 years old with my mother when she was putting me to bed. I asked her a question. I said, Mom, if there's only one God, why are there so many religions? And it's a question that has fascinated me ever since. You know, and if you really look at it and you say, well, most people say, well, what's the difference between a Shia and a Sunni? What's the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant? Well, there isn't any different. Or we all believe in the Jewish God. But what about the Jewish God and the gods that came before? And you know, Buddha's a little bit different, but in the end, if you think of it as one God, you say, well, everybody expresses it differently, but it's still, you know, basically don't kill people and be compassionate and love people. And so that's basically all Star Wars.
Seen anything like this before?
Nobody's seen this for 100 years. We're worshiping Kali.
भक्ति देगी काली माँ